somebody can help Denzel, I'll be very much happy. Very, very happy. Thank you very much, Denzel.
It's 14 minutes past, and I suppose, that's how the economy, that's what speaks to the economy. And so maybe Peter Sithole, Chief Executive of the Vumelana Advisory Fund, has an understanding of the changes when people do have the land, the changes that one does find that, it can make in one's life. Let me bring Peter Sithole into the conversation, the Chief Executive of the Vumelana Advisory Fund, joining us basically to reflect on some of the fundamental discussions, also on the resolutions of the 55th ANC Elective Conference paying focus on land reform and what land actually means in a country to ours. Peter, welcome to Power Perspective. Welcome to Power 98.7. How are you, Peter?
I'm good, and how are you? And thank you for inviting me and welcoming me.
Sure. Peter, when you listen to the previous, voice note that I suppose the hardships that one goes through and the opportunities that one has or one doesn't have because of the kind of circumstances we're in. And when I look at the land issue, it's that same conversation. You either have, the opportunities if you have land, or if you don't have land, you don't have the opportunities that would come with that. It would be in that same context, right? And that's how crucial the land issue is.
Yeah. Thank you. I suppose the Dominic story is actually very much a South African story, if you like, because I think it really resonates with most of us, because particularly this time of the year, you find it that a lot of people are really struggling to get their kids or their children to good schools, etc. But having said that, you're raising an important point that even in the land reform space, you find it that people who have got land or who do not have land are actually lamenting that they need land parcels that they can work. And I think this needs to be really put into perspective.
Yeah.
That as a country, we are really usually fixated with, really getting the land to the people, etc. But what happens to that land once it has been transferred remains largely ignored, and hence the failure that we are seeing in some of the land reform projects. And I think to address this, we need to make sure that there's some level of support once beneficiaries of land reform are given the land. Just to put it blunt, giving somebody the land without giving this person the resources, the skills, and the generally finance and other forms of support to be able to work this land is tantamount to setting up this specific person for failure. So we need to address that as a country.
Peter, let me ask you why we don't have that particular conversation in one conversation, why it necessarily needs to be two conversations. The one part of we get fixated on getting the land, yes, and there's a land issue. We had the PAC earlier on in the studio that talks to the land, and if you go to the ANC, and it's going to be a huge election conversation piece as well. So there is this fixation with getting the land and access to the land and that particular aspect. Why do we find that we don't engage necessarily the other aspect, which you have crucially, just put on the table now and said, so what happens once the land is transferred? Why is that not one conversation that we're having, two very separate conversations about it? One is the fixation with the land, and we want the land, but we're not having the other conversation with it. Or, are we fixated enough not to understand, that the one comes with the other, or that the one belongs to the other, and that, as you point out, if you don't have the resources, skills, and finances, it's going to be a failure in the first instance. Why is it not one comprehensive conversation?
I think there are a number of reasons why this is not a one conversation, just to use your way. I mean, first and foremost, land is a highly emotive issue, you know, given our history, particularly as black people, you know. So it is, whilst it is equally important to really emphasize the fact that there's a need from a transformation point of view to make sure that people have got access to land and the wrongs of the past are addressed. We've got this part that we seem to be, you know, not really focusing on. And I suppose why the fixation is, with the advent of democracy, one of the immediate things that we wanted to do as a nation was to make sure that there is transformation. And transformation, amongst others, was defined along the lines, amongst others, that people must get the land, you know. But I think one needs to give credit to some of the developments that have since happened. I think there's now broader realization within government and including the private sector that if we are to make it and if we are to ensure that we have sustainable and successful land reform, we need to ensure that we provide post-settlement support. We are seeing the private sector actually coming on board. We are seeing government in various formats coming on board. As an organization, as we continue to work with various private sector parties who are really playing a huge role in ensuring that we can partner with beneficiaries of land reform to ensure productive use of this land. But I think we need to do more than that. We need to really, first and foremost, have this conversation as a country. We need to take a step back and look at the challenges as they manifest themselves. We need to also look at what progress have we made as a country. We need to also define realistically where do we want to be, say in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, etc. Because I think part of the challenge is if you cannot set realistic targets, it becomes very difficult for you to really do any form of evaluation, review, etc. So for me, having this broader conversation becomes an important part of what needs to happen.
I'm going to ask you about evaluation and review and the progress made, later on in the conversation. But let me just ask you at this particular point here now. We're going to see SONA in, a few days' time, really, in February, and then we'll also have the budget. If you go back to SONA of last year, previous year, 2023, one could argue that not much was said about land reform in that particular speech. There were talks about small scale farming and assisting there, but you could argue that maybe not fundamentally enough that it was spoken about. Budget came, and also there was some speak of alleviation and what could be done. Are you hoping that in this particular SONA and maybe in this particular budget as well, more emphasis over maybe more grander scale is spoken to around land restitution, land reform, and land transferal? And maybe not merely because it's an election year from a political perspective, but maybe from a genuine, perspective of, a country needing to do right by a people who have been marginalized for so long.
Yeah, I think you're raising an important point. In fact, my view is, I think if one looks at SONA, including the budget speech, I think there was quite a lot really on land reform more broadly. I mean, just to give as an example, one of the announcements that the president made was the fact that the land reform and the development agency will be created, and it will facilitate really better coordination and reduce red tape and serve as a one-stop on issues related to land reform and development. And I think this was really music in the eyes of many people, And we are also conscious of the fact that there have been other developments. For example, the Land Court Bill, which has been in Parliament for quite some time. I think it has now been finalized. which for the first time provides for the establishment of the Land Court and the Land Court of Appeal. And this obviously will go a long way towards addressing the backlogs, experience with adjudicating disputes in the Land Claims Court, because then we'll be having a permanent and specialized court, and it will also develop much needed jurisprudence on land issues. So it's not as if there's nothing happening. There's quite a lot happening. We also know about the expropriation bill that it's also being finalized, because if there's one thing, you need policy certainty. This will bring much needed clarity and align the expropriation law with the Constitution. And I mean, one of the stuff that I picked up on the bill was that it must not, expropriation must not be used arbitrarily. It must only be used as a last resort. It detailed the procedures to be followed and provide for this recourse to the cost. So there is that. And in addition to that, a vast amount of land have been transferred to Black South Africa. And I think
you can't deny that. Yeah.
We have to give credit to government for that. And the president has really highlighted this in the speech. Certainly even at the 55th edition of the elective conference. These are some of the factors that we've highlighted. I mean, 9 million hectares that have been given back to South Africans in the form of redistribution or restitution. I think it's an important milestone. But having said this, more needs to be done in terms of addressing the slow pace of implementation, because I think the challenge with us as South Africans is we are very good at coming up with policies, etc. But when it comes to implementation, I think we need to really check up we just need to make sure that we do more to make sure that we can implement that which we have started or that where pronouncements have been made.
Where the private sector is concerned, and you said, government has done, but you're talking about the implementation and the limitations there. The private sector, and I think if I heard you right, there is now broader realization amongst the private sector as well that, one needs to engage in this particular aspect. How much of the private sector do you think has come on board? I mean, you're dealing with the private sector in essence through the fund, and you're dealing with aspects of the land. Do you find that the shift is beginning to happen, or the shift has happened, and we're advanced down that particular road? There's an acceptance now.
I think there's broader realization out there, particularly within the private sector, to come to the party. I think there's acceptance that in order to maintain effective social cohesion amongst South Africans, land reform has got to be implemented in an efficient way, and the private sector has got a big role to play there. Our work as an organization as Women are the best testimony to the fact that partnerships, for example, between beneficiaries of land reform and the private sector is probably at the moment the most immediate way through which we can address the current challenges. Because you have a situation where people have got the land, but government does not necessarily have adequate resources in the form of funding resources.
Which is the second conversation we were talking about and saying, why isn't it one?
Exactly. So since just over the last 10 years of our existence, as an example, we've supported over 25 community projects, which attracted in excess of R1 billion in private investment. That's putting into productive use in excess of 72,000 hectares of land and benefiting more than 16,000 households. I think only if we can replicate this. However, to do this, we need financial resources to support the communities. And I believe government, the private parties, the private sector, and the donor community can contribute towards ensuring that we can expand on supporting land reform beneficiary communities, thus creating much needed jobs and really promote social cohesion. So having said that, it's clear that the private sector does realize that they've got a role to play. There are various pockets of success out there. And I think the one thing that we are not doing very well as a country is to actually highlight those pockets of success and actually replicate those pockets of success.
Peter, before I get to the partnership in the the beneficiaries of land and the reforms and the partnership, of course, of the advisory fund, and I want to get to that conversation in a second. How does the private sector come to the party? Just give us an understanding of, I understand government's responsibility, government's role in all of it, and the constitutional aspects to it. There is an acknowledgement that it needs to be done. How does the private sector engage this particular space? Where and how do they become practically involved in this particular space?
Yeah. At the point when land is actually transferred to beneficiaries of land reform, to black people mainly, all that they've got is these land parcels that have been transferred to them, and they've got nothing else. I know that government from time to time will promise that they will provide grants, etc. But in reality, sometimes those grants actually never materialize. So what we have been doing as an organization has been to facilitate these partnerships. Typically how we work is we would either be approached by a specific community that says, we've got a piece of land that we've received from government by way of restitution, etc. But we don't know and we don't have the resources to really work the land. And our role would be to assist them in mobilizing private investment. We work through independent transaction advisors whom we source depending on the nature of the project that we are supporting. As an example, if it's in the agricultural sector, we will pull in a team of transaction advisors. Usually they would have deal-making, financial and community facilitation skills. We'll appoint this team of transaction advisors. From there, they would handhold the community and embark on this exercise to identify potential partners that can partner and come and actually invest. So you've got a situation where the community will be bringing the land and the private party will be bringing finance, the skills, and access to market. Because access to market is something that we don't always emphasize. Because you can have all these things, but if you don't have access to market, you've got a problem.
Yeah, it's the lack of networks, for example.
The lack of the networks.
Yeah.
So that's what the private parties are doing. Now, you need independent transaction advisors to facilitate this because communities are less sophisticated. Your private parties will come with their lawyers, with their accountants, etc. So this is where we come in as an organization to make sure that we can balance the interest of the community and the private investors to make sure that this becomes a win-win solution. And this is what we have been doing over the last couple of years, and that's how the private parties are coming through.
Sure.
Our experience has been that if you leave the communities on their own to negotiate with private sector partners or private practitioners, because of this unevenness or inequality in terms of the skill set, etc., frequently you find that sometimes communities are not necessarily taken for a ride, but you find that the agreement is skewed more on the side of the private party. So you need skilled, transaction advisors who can mediate between these two parties to make sure that it becomes a win-win. You can imagine a situation where for example, the executive committee does negotiation on its own without any form of assistance. They go on to sign this agreement. And the next thing, you'll have a consent group complaining that the executive committee...
Which has happened.
They've been taken for a ride, or they are pocketing some money, etc. And which takes me to another important part. We have to make sure that you put good governance, because it's a key ingredient in successful land reform. and it's a key contributor to high failure rate amongst land reform projects because it leads to mistrust and infightings and may lead to destruction of assets by disgruntled members of the community. So what we also do over and above this facilitation is to make sure that we provide organizational development support, amongst the communities that we support so that they can improve on their governance. We can make sure that they put in place policies and procedures so that they can run their affairs in a much more, transparent manner. They can come up, they can produce annual financial statements. And in that way, you minimize infightings amongst the communities.
Peter, who needs necessarily to come to you first? Is it the communities that come to you generally first and say, we've got pockets of land and we're not able to work this particular space, and then you would then find the particular partner, and then you would engage through all of those legalities until things find signatures on a piece of paper, and both parties are kind of happy with the agreements, and at some point you potentially or probably walk away with it, walk away from it. Who comes to you first? Do you find that, funders would come to you first as well, the private sector, and suggest to you that, because they know you're engaged in this particular space, or do the communities generally find you first?
I think the answer is all of the above.
Okay.
We have instances where communities actually approach us to say we've got these land parcels, and then we will do our own assessment to determine whether this is a project that we can support. And I'll come to that point.
Yeah.
We would also be approached by our private players themselves who say we are looking for opportunities. We know that we work with communities. These are the areas that we would like to invest. Can you actually help us? So we'll do that. And we also work very closely with government. There's particularly the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. They do approach us from time to time to say, can you support these communities where they are transferring the land? So that's how we are approached. But because there's a huge demand for this kind of a service, as an organization, our resources are limited. We can't possibly support everyone.
Which is, would that be a good thing, Peter? Would that, because you're saying, because there's such a big demand, would that be a good thing? That it would, if I'm listening to you, it would mean that there are people with pockets of land that need assistance, and you need to get to them. That would be a good thing?
Yeah, that would be a good thing. But the point that I was emphasizing is that because this level of support doesn't come cheap.
Yeah.
Remember, I'm saying we work with experienced transaction advisors.
Yeah.
And as Vumelane, we carry the cost of these transaction advisors. And once the deal has been concluded, we recover our costs from the investing party. That's how our model actually works.
From the investing party, which is the private sector. Yeah.
Which is the private sector, which means the community never has to pay for this. The service that we provide, we carry the cost and we take the risk, So which is why we have an elaborate assessment that we do internally before we decide on taking a specific project. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Sometimes we are approached by a community, and when we do an assessment, we find that the level of infighting within that community is such that there is no right-minded investor who would invest. Investors don't come into this project because it's charity. They come into this project because they want to invest their hard-earned money, and they want to make a profit. And communities also need to make a profit. So you can imagine if there are infightings within the community, it's not likely to fly. So that's why we've got elaborate processes internally to do an assessment before we decide on supporting a specific project.
Sure.
And we also tend to also be biased towards projects where, one, we can create more jobs, especially in the light of what you've said. When we started with this discussion, we highlighted an issue around joblessness in this country. The reality is that in some of the land reform projects, as and when the land claims were settled, some of the jobs were lost because you'll find that the previous owners left and the project collapsed, and as a result, people lost jobs as a result of that. So we are more biased towards ensuring that in such projects we intervene so that we can save existing jobs in the first place. Secondly, in instances where we can create more jobs, and we will typically look at projects where we can create 100 or more jobs because of this joblessness crisis that we are facing as a country.
Sure. You've just led into my next question, because I was going to ask you about scale, and when I think about scale, I'm also thinking about sustainability also then, because of futuristic aspects. The kind of scale that you engage in these transactional entities, just where do they range from? What kind of is it driven by the number of jobs you can create? Is it driven by the amount that's investable in a particular project, or is it regarding produce that would be generated from whatever is going to be farmed on the particular, what are the entities that engage the conversation of scale and sustainability then?
Yeah, our focus really is on creating much needed jobs, creating income and skills for the community. And typically we'd be looking at projects where the minimum investment amount is around 10 million rands and above. And some of the projects that we are actually supporting the investment thresholds would be above 100 million and sometimes even much more than that. We are also looking at least those projects where we can at least save or create 100 jobs and more. Yeah. But most importantly, we are looking at projects which can have a demonstration effect. Because of the failure rate that we've seen within the land reform space, as an agent of change, part of what we are trying to do is to really, demonstrate that partnerships, between the private, it is possible to create partnerships, viable partnerships between the private sector and beneficiary communities.
The collaborative approach, then. The
collaborative approach, because if you look at how things started some 20-something years, 30 years ago, when land reform actually started, it was really unheard of to have the private sector really partnering with the beneficiary communities. There was an expectation that government would actually be funding this project. Yeah. But if you look at the huge demand on the government fiscus, from your grants to your, now it's the beginning of the year, NSFAS must fund students, etc. All this money comes from one and the same pot, So you find that there's really limited resources that are earmarked, as it were, to support climate communities. Yeah. So partnerships is the immediate way through which you can address this.
Peter, did you find it difficult, I must ask, did you find it difficult in the land space, and land ownership and beneficiation of land and ownership of land? Did you find it a difficult conversation to have where, you bring in a conversation then of collaboration or a different approach to this land issue of, yes, you will get the land, and then there's a responsibility immediately that government will come and supply a tractor, or that, government was, like, for example, supplying cows and chickens and all sorts of things at one point, trying to get these ventures off the ground. Was it a difficult conversation to have with communities whereby you would suggest to a community that now you own the land, you do not have the necessary means to go and work that particular land, and we have a partner that will come on board and assist, and this is how they will assist you, but to your benefit, and that, you know, both of you will benefit in this particular way, because there's always that conversation and deep held, you know, conversation in the South African context that, yes, you do want the land, the fixation of having the land and then working the land and your ownership and your fingers in that particular land. It's a very different conversation where you say, okay, get the land and don't do anything because, you know, you might not have the resources, but I have a partner for you. Was it an easy conversation to have, understanding the historical context of how people wanted to have access and have the land?
Well, we come from a very painful history. I mean, as you know, so trust issues always would always be key in these relationships. You know, you know, when you are having discussions with the community and you are bringing on board, or a private investor is coming on board, you know, usually you'll find that there are some, I mean, communities are not usually too trusting, you know, because of the history that we come from. You know? And a lot of times we will find that our people don't always understand some of the complexities associated with commercial arrangements, you know. So it has been a journey that we've had to traverse as an organization. First and foremost, to develop rapport with these communities, and also to develop a track record where we are viewed as an objective party. Because in all these relationships that we are actually structuring, we don't benefit a cent as an organization because we are a non-profit public.
Yeah, you're an NGO.
Yes, and also the parties, rather individual, the transaction advisors who mediate, who we bring on board to mediate between these parties, they remain independent, meaning they are not allowed to take any kickbacks or benefit anything from this transaction, so that they can remain fiercely independent to make sure that it becomes a win-win situation. They can take care of the interest of the community because the community is less sophisticated, as it were. So over time, communities became more trusting, etc., and they accepted the notion that they can't do it on their own. They need experienced parties who have got access to resources, including finance, to partner with them so that they can work the land. You know, but again, to be fair, even on the government side, I mean, this is a conversation that we've had, and it took a bit of time. For even the policymakers or government officials,
I would assume, I would
to embrace this, because you, on the one hand, you've got these parties whose role was to secure land for these parties, for the community. Now you are coming and you are saying you are bringing back the investor to come and work with the community. You know, it takes time for people to really understand some of these, you know, commercial arrangements and how do they work in practice. And the fact that, I mean, let me give you another scenario.
Yeah.
You give people land, they've got a crop that's fairly sophisticated. Let's say maybe it's in forestry arena or the sector. You give it to the community. They've never been involved in forestry. You know, they don't understand the complexities associated with managing a forestry operation. You give them the money. You know, chances are, even by giving them money and expecting them to work on their own, that project is likely to collapse. Simply because they don't have the technical know-how to run that type of a business. They don't have the management skills to handle that. They do not even have clue at times how the market operates and how to access the market. So you always need people who've got the technical know-how to get involved in some way or the other. You know.
When do you walk away, Peter? Or do you ever walk away? You know, because I have an understanding as well. When you said, we don't make a cent from this, we're an NGO. And my understanding is that even those funds that are reimbursed to you by the private sector, you know, the funder, are used by you, of course, then to go and support other, you know, initiations. That's my understanding of it. So,
yes.
So you walk away and you go and you do something else productively with that as well. Do you ever walk away?
Yes, we do walk away. However, what we do, once the agreement has been concluded between the private investor and the beneficiary community, we would do an assessment to look at what are the other areas of support that we need to put in place, or support that we need to put in place for the community, particularly around governance, you know. So we will do that assessment and then, you know, support the community with ensuring that they can develop policies and procedures. They can start, you know, essentially organizational development and capacity building. You know. We would, depending on the nature and the sophistication of the communal property association or the landowning trust, we would, for example, hold them up to a point where they've, you know, published their first set of financials, audited financials, or they've presented this to the broader community, because that's what we encourage. Because what our experience has been that in those instances, or with those communities where you don't have transparency and good governance, the minute the first R1 million lent into the bank account, the communities are up in arms and they are fighting amongst one another. So leaving them without really capacitating them so that they can run their affairs better is really setting them up for failure. So we would walk away at a point when we have also done some bit of capacitation, and which is why, as an organization, we do a lot of fundraising. We approach various parties to say, this is the work that we are doing. Come, we can take you to some of the sites where we've supported communities so that you can see, you know, and then we engage with them so that they can support our work.
Are there enough is there enough interest, Peter, from the private sector? Is there enough financial capacity in that space? You know, that is there. Do you have them? You know, do you have a little black book, for example, that says, you know, I've got people who are just waiting for opportunity for engagement in this? You know, is that capacity there? Or is it sometimes a necessity of once you understand a community as a piece of land, and then you go and try to find, you know, the investor and the private sector partner? Or, you know, do you have a little black book that already says, you know, yeah, people are on board and people are here and they're wanting to get involved in this particular thing?
Well, as I've said, we work through experienced transaction advisors. As an example, if the project that we are supporting is in the agricultural space, we would enlist a panel of transaction advisors who are experienced in that arena. If it's in the ecotourism sector, similarly, we would have transaction advisors who are experienced in the ecotourism sector. The same with forestry and other areas. So we've got our fingers through the panel of transaction advisors that we work with.
But do you have
where the opportunities are?
Do you have the little black book on the funders as well?
Well, essentially on potential partners.
Okay.
For who would enter into partnerships with beneficiary communities. The funding aspect that I was relating to is more funding for Vumelana as an organization. That's where we are fundraising. And this is the part which has been somewhat a bit of an uphill, because yes, we've got a number of private sector operators who are supporting us as an organization because they see the good work that we are doing. But I think it takes a while. It takes a bit of really convincing people, getting them to understand what we do, seeing the value of our work, etc., that people can come on board. So this is not an event; it's a process and a lot of engagement that we embark upon, so that we can get that level of support.
Peter, you know what, Peter? What an interesting conversation. What an interesting initiative, and what the difference that of course the Vumelana Advisory Fund would make. I mean, common sense to me, 101 stuff to me, of the difference that your intervention makes, your collaboration makes. Peter, thank you so much for coming on to Power Perspective tonight. Much, much appreciated. And of course, down the line also, as conversations about land also then, are spoken of. Let's have further conversations around this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Thanks. Bye for now.
Cheers. That's Peter Satow, Chief Executive of the Vumelana Advisory Fund, talking to us there about, of course, how they get involved in collaborating between those who have pockets of land and those who have the capacity to work that land. Sometimes you have the land, but you can't, and you need the funding to take place. You need, of course, financial security to engage, and financial confidence to engage as well. And that's where Peter and, of course, the Vumelana Advisory Fund come into play. Chief Executive there. And so, yes, that's how we get to the end of the show. It is about 4.5 minutes to the top of the hour, and we're almost into the new day. Let's take a break, and we'll begin to end the show.
They are dynamic, bright little minds.
It's 10 minutes past 11 o'clock. We're into the last quarter here of Power Perspective. The Chief Executive of the Vumelana Advisory Fund is with me. Peter Satow is my guest next, but let's just listen to two of your voice notes before I engage Peter Satow. You do want to listen to this particular conversation. It's, of course, about land reform and the land reform program, and how the Chief Executive of the Vumelana Advisory Fund could maybe just be the person you need to maybe listen to if you're thinking or have or engaging in any business-related issue, particularly the land reform program and how they work that particular space and what they bring to that particular space. But let's listen to at least two of your voice notes before we head there.
Send us your voice notes on 083